1991, City Council person Dororthy Mae Taylor launched a campaign to rid Mardi Gras societies of their racist roots and change the face of Mardi Gras as we know it. This campaign is the reason that Rex is the only 19th century carnival society that still parades.
I have questions for you about our future at the dynamo in the sky. And I had answers too, but they seem less together. And then at the time I applied.
The Mardi Gras Field Guide. I think it goes without saying that New Orleans is known for many things, but Mardi Gras is often at the top of the list. I grew up knowing that Louisiana has a unique tradition in the Mardi Gras, but I only recently discovered the deeper history behind the traditions of the people of Louisiana. I sacrificed my feet to Mardi Gras parades throughout my Louisiana public education, and now I'd like to present a parade of facts as we've come to accept them. The historic origins of Carnival go back to the Roman Empire, but we're focusing on the North American additions to the tradition. But speaking of Roman roots, if you're wondering why the date of Mardi Gras changes, the answer is the same as why Easter changes. Easter is celebrated on the first Sunday following the full moon after the spring equinox, if you didn't know. Mardi Gras is 47 days before that, 40 days of Lent plus 7 Sundays. In 1699, brothers Iberville and Bienville were traversing the Mississippi when they realized it was Mardi Gras Day. Iberville named the spot where they found themselves Point du Mardi Gras in celebration, and the first Mardi Gras celebration on the North American continent went down in history. 4 years later, in 1703, Mobile, Alabama claims the first Mardi Gras celebration for their city, and often the first ever on the North American continent. We'll let them have this claim. Back to New Orleans. The city was established in 1718, and it was the Marquis du Vaudreuil in the 1740s who is commonly credited with bringing the culture of balls and elegant masquerades to New Orleans, which he hoped to operate as a court like Versailles. This was the seed planted which inspired Mardi Gras as we know it. For almost the next 100 years, Mardi Gras celebrations, if they existed, were just balls with dancing and drinking, and sometimes duels to settle disputes of honor. According to the website MardiGrasNewOrleans.com, the earliest reference to Carnival in New Orleans was in 1781, when the Perseverance Benevolent and Mutual Aid Society formed. But several other sources put this date at 1783 and say this was the predecessor to second line parades, a tradition that is tangential to Mardi Gras. The first reference to Carnival or Mardi Gras I could find in the newspaper database is in 1805 in a report printed in a Vermont newspaper about a trip to New Orleans, where the writer encountered Carnival subscription balls. According to the book Music in New Orleans, The Formative Years, 1791 through 1841, Carnival subscription balls were society balls for people who didn't want to attend public balls, but also wanted to dance more than at private balls. The intention was to keep those balls more exclusive by limiting the number of people who could subscribe, but these balls were still attended by hundreds or even 1,000 people. The next reference I find is in 1812, and it is most curious, so I'll just read it to you. Quote, "We shall have a pleasant carnival in this city, and, as usual, it will terminate with a number of marriages and few disappointments. The produce of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee will be in the market, abundant and low. Comus." Unquote. Then, an 1815 mention of Carnival in a Pennsylvania paper when Alexander Cochrane decided to stay in New Orleans through the Carnival season after the Battle of New Orleans and during the War of 1812. The battle was fought on January 8, 1815. Could it be that Cochrane, one of the leaders of the British who lost the battle, was in New Orleans for the battle because he decided to stay for Mardi Gras? Who knows? Then, in 1826, a merchant begs to be included in the Mardi Gras festivities by promising to please and accommodate any who may, quote, favor him with their custom, unquote. Next, in 1834, we find an exasperated column wondering how the expense of Mardi Gras is afforded in a Nashville paper that followed several articles from New Orleans papers about the failing bank. Mardi Gras still appears to be based on attending extravagant balls at this point in history. We trace the first Mardi Gras parade to 1837. To set the stage, Andrew Jackson was president until March, and then Martin Van Buren took over. 1837 is the year that Paul Morphy, the famous chess champion from New Orleans, was born. This is the beginning of the Victorian time, with the Queen taking the throne on June 20th. The Picayune, the predecessor to the Times-Picayune, was established on January 25th. Mardi Gras was on February 14th in 1837. Many balls are mentioned in the days around Mardi Gras, but I found no parades mentioned, except there is a cowbellion mentioned on February 8th, 1837. Cowbellion was the name developed in Mobile similar to Krewe in New Orleans. They first paraded in 1735 on New Year's Day, and I found numerous sources claiming Mobile newspapers reported that the cowbellion also paraded in New Orleans that year. I could not find the newspaper article these sources referred to. In 1838, the Daily Picayune finally gave a description to the Crescent City tradition. Quote, on this last occasion, great pains were taken to get up the affair in proper style. A large number of young gentlemen, principally Creoles of the first respectability, went to no little expense with their preparations. In the procession were several carriages superbly ornamented, bands of music, horses richly caparisoned, personations of knights, cavaliers, heroes, demigods, chanceliers, buccinellos, etc., etc., all mounted. Many of them were dressed in female attire and acted the lady with no small degree of grace. Nearly all of them had their features concealed with masks. The crowds which preceded accompanied and followed them like a vast river. We have never seen exactly such a throng, and the numberless pretty faces which decorated the balconies with their bright smiles were no small addition to the interest of the scene." Unquote. In 1841, their paper reported that the municipal affairs were suspended in favor of the humors of Mardi Gras. The tradition seems to have briefly returned to balls with an ad in an 1843 paper, and then a write-up about the amusements of the day outside of balls. In 1846, we find an article about reviving the tradition. Quote, "The observance of Mardi Gras is one of the peculiarities of New Orleans as an American city, and this strangers will realize on Tuesday. For they will see in motley procession dresses splendid but fantastical, masks of all times and nations, Turks and Jews and harlequins and clowns with feats gymnastical, Greeks, Romans, Yankee Doodles, and Hindus." However, the 1847 write-up discusses violent occurrences including throwing flour and mud at maskers, but that the balls were, quote, "a redeeming and agreeable feature in the celebrations of the day." Unquote. In 1850, the street parade tradition seems to be lost entirely. The Times-Picayune reported, quote, "Formerly in this city, particularly among our downtown friends, there were gay processions during the day, in which masquerades of every variety of grotesque costume, for motley was the only wear for the nonce, sought to witch the world with noble horsemanship, but with the gradual spread of intelligence, perhaps it would be better to say, with the predominance which material interests have obtained among us in this utilitarian age, the carnival maskers have almost entirely disappeared, or, shunning the eye of the day, only exhibit their glories and their mysteries at night in the ballroom." Unquote. The 1851 write-up is particularly harsh. Quote, "Unsuccessful attempts were made by a few nondescript individuals yesterday to carry out the street gaieties and masking frolics of Mardi Gras. They were miserable failures, and nonetheless annoying that they were failures. They should be put to a stop to hereafter." Unquote. Again, the evening ended with celebrated balls. In 1852, determined to bring it back with a planned route printed in the paper, quote, "It is well understood, we believe, that all persons desirous of joining the procession of masquerades today to celebrate Mardi Gras will meet in Orleans Street in front of the French Opera House as soon after 3 o'clock in the afternoon as possible, so as to be ready to move by 3:30. The procession will move from Royal Street to St. Anne Street, around Jackson Square, back to Royal, up Royal, along Canal, down Rampart, along Esplanade to Royal Street, proceeding on this route as long as each individual pleases." Unquote. It worked. The write-up that year explains that the procession filled the streets to an uncomfortable degree. Then in 1853, the crescendo had subsided and Mardi Gras did not come. Quote, "Mardi Gras' real glories have departed forever, and he has to resign his daylight honors for evening soirees and fancy dress parties." Unquote. In 1855, Mardi Gras caused a little chaos when someone dressed up as a priest. The New Orleans Crescent memorialized the 1856 Mardi Gras. Quote, "Some feeble attempts there were at the street display which once heralded the gorgeousness of the evening, but their pale and ineffectual fires only served to show how a paralysis had struck the limbs, and how it was only in the heart that the lifeblood still circulated freely." Unquote. This article goes on and on about the many balls held in celebration. In 1857, the story goes, 6 men from Mobile, Alabama, invited their friends to meet at the Gem Coffee House on Royal Street to form the Mystic Krewe of Comus, coining the word crew and modern Mardi Gras secret societies. That year, they pulled off a parade with the theme of Paradise Lost. The Library of Congress has a Mardi Gras handbook printed in 1874 that explains each of the parades from the beginning until it was printed. Comus pursued elaborate themes for their parades. The routes were not pre-planned or announced, so the crowds were out looking for Comus to appear. Between 1862 and 1865, during the Civil War, there were no parades held, but parades resumed with the 6th celebration of the Mystic Krewe of Comus in 1866. This year, Mobile printed a write-up about the New Orleans Mardi Gras. According to Arthur Hardy, Mardi Gras historian, the parades in Mobile were held on New Year's Eve until 1866, when they switched to Mardi Gras. The Library of Congress has an invitation from the 1867 Comus event, so we can get a tiny peek behind the curtain. In 1870, the 12th Night Revelers were established. While not a parading crew, it celebrates 12th Night, or January 6th, the day the wise men reached baby Jesus with gifts. So by 1870, the bookends of carnival crews were established and celebrated. 1871 was the first year for throws when a 12th Night Reveler dressed as Santa Claus threw trinkets from his float, according to Arthur Hardy. In 1872, King of Carnival, Rex, was established by businessmen in New Orleans. Rex was the first daytime parade in an attempt to establish order around the chaos that led to violence on previous Mardi Gras celebrations. This is also when the traditional colors, purple for justice, gold for power, and green for faith, were introduced, and the year the governor signed the Mardi Gras Act, making Mardi Gras a legal holiday in Louisiana. Orlando Hamilton Brewster, who was born in Buffalo and came to Louisiana in 1865, attempted to repeal the act in 1875. Governor Kellogg, who was also from the Northeast but seemed to understand the people of Louisiana better than his colleague, vetoed that attempt, and it remains a legal holiday to this day, made almost mandatory by the utter inability to do anything but Mardi Gras in New Orleans and several other places in the state on Mardi Gras Day. Zooming into the future, we don't get the first official parade of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club until 1916, but Zulu was celebrating its own royalty sometime earlier than that. This 1904 article explains that the Zulu king was a part of the custom for some time by then. The crew of Iris, the oldest of all women crews still parading, began forming around 1917 and paraded for the first time in 1959. In 1959, the story goes, H. Alvin Sharp walked into the office of Darwin S. Fenner, the captain of Rex, and threw a handful of homemade aluminum coins in his face. He knew his doubloons would be a hit at Mardi Gras, and he wanted to convince them that they were safe with his display. He was an artist from Kentucky who had been in the Navy and settled in New Orleans. Fenner was convinced, and the first 80,000 doubloons were produced for the 1960 Mardi Gras a few months later. Sharp was right. The doubloons are still a hit more than 60 years later. You can find some of those first doubloons for sale online for hundreds of dollars. The floats of parades went through the French Quarter until 1973, when they were banned because they were too big to be safe in the narrow 18th century French Quarter streets. If you're coming to town anytime between January 6th and February 13th in 2024, you will be joining us for carnival season. Be prepared to enjoy parades anytime, anywhere. Here are some tips and tricks to have the most pleasant season. If you have different mobility needs or just would like a place to sit, buy grandstand tickets on St. Charles Avenue. Visit www.neworleansparadetickets.com for more information. It's also linked in the description. Regardless of where you decide to enjoy the parade, download the Parade Tracker app. It is a live update of where the parade is. It also includes information about start times and which routes each parade takes. It's a valuable tool during the season. You can also get a wristband from a church or school near you to ensure a place to pee. If you're looking for your sober pals, there's a sober tent on Napoleon Avenue. You can find more information about the organization who hosts it in the description. Some of the coveted throws that you may seek during your adventure are the hand-decorated shoes handed out personally by the Muses during their parade, the doubloons minted by many crews each year, and the coconuts handed out by Zulu. Each parade will have a unique throw for your collection. The carnival season is littered with constant events, but some of the must-see adventures during the final weekend of Mardi Gras are the greasing of the poles at the Royal Sinesta, the meeting of the courts on Lundi Gras, the sunrise wake-up call by the Northside Skull and Bones gang with their reminder that it is later than you think, the St. Anne Society March, and so many amazing secret parades and parties to find and get invited to. Carnival is another aspect of New Orleans that makes it truly American. It's fat and decadent and loud and colorful and happy and creative and filled with the cultures from around the world. We adopted the customs from other places, but turned it into our own thing. No topic or subject is off limits, no costumes too outrageous, and the cultures celebrated through the themes are endless. But we can only appreciate the good aspects of Mardi Gras by remembering the bad. Mardi Gras has been plagued by violence, racism, and exclusionary power grabs since the beginning. Secret organizations are often surrounded by mystery and conspiracies. Mardi Gras crews are no different, and in the 187 years since New Orleanians started parading, several controversies have swelled. Unsurprisingly, the exclusivity of the clubs and their explicit exclusion of certain types of people are at the center of most of the controversy. But let's start with the basics. Eating king cake out of season. More than a faux pas, some will tell you that eating this confectionery treat outside of carnival time will earn curses for the city. King cake is the treat associated with the carnival season and only to be consumed between January 6th, the Epiphany, and Mardi Gras Day. Arthur Hardy describes the history of the king cake tradition in his book, Mardi Gras in New Orleans, An Illustrated History. It began with an ancient custom of celebrating surviving the winter by making a crown-shaped cake with the wheat from the previous year. Hardy explains that Romans added the tradition of choosing a king, and then the Catholic Church said, "Mine," in the 4th century. The custom came to New Orleans via Creoles. While the truth of the curse can be debated, there is no doubt that the scarcity created by this tradition is why king cakes are such a beloved sweet in New Orleans. Just like the formation of organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, who erected huge statues of Confederate leaders decades after the Civil War, were attempts to establish and maintain power through intimidation, it is no coincidence that the first organization of a Mardi Gras crew occurred right around the time of the Civil War and flourished during Reconstruction. Instead of egalitarian street parades with everyone flooding the street together, all masked and hidden from judgment for the day, the parades of secret crews became elevated above the crowd, carried by elaborate floats, literally reigning above their subjects. The formalities of giving Rex the city for the day furthers the facade. The ban on allowing sponsors ensures that the crews themselves foot the bill, at least publicly, and shower the plebeians with their gifts. All aspects of the illusion are meant to establish and maintain power, just as the hereditary royalty of Europe used pageantry and parade to maintain their power, explained Rosalie O'Neill in her book, New Orleans Carnival Cruise, The History, Spirit, and Secrets of Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras has been canceled a few times in history, mostly coinciding with wars. The most recent cancellation was in 2021 during the pandemic. The first official cancellation was from 1862 to 1865 during the Civil War. Then it was canceled again a decade later because of political conditions during Reconstruction. In 1875, the same year the governor vetoed an attempt to take away the legal holiday status of Mardi Gras, the parades once again did not roll. Governor Kellogg was one of two declared winners of the 1874 governor's election. The opposition staged a revolt called the Battle of Canal Street, the Battle of the White League, or the Battle of Liberty Place. All of those capable in the Old Line Carnival Cruise participated in the revolt, according to O'Neill. Indeed, we may draw a direct line from the KKK, which did not allow Catholics, to the establishment of Carnival Cruise in New Orleans, who were initially mainly Catholic. O'Neill writes, quote, "While the Klan became increasingly violent, the carnival societies grew increasingly decorative and social, much like beauty pageants, to woo the world into a fantasy hierarchy." Unquote. Much like religious conservatives like to hoist signs about hell above Bourbon Street crowds, the KKK was never anti-Catholic enough to avoid masking for Mardi Gras when they were allowed. They decided to have queens to match the kings in 1884, but the queens were not secret. The first queens of Comus were the daughters of Robert E. Lee and several other prominent Confederates, a clear statement on the feelings of the powerful but secret members of the Mardi Gras cruise. In 1916, the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club formally organized for the first time as a clear critique of the power and royalty of the Old Line Mardi Gras cruise. Zulu was seen as mocking the traditional Mardi Gras royalty from the beginning. Similarly, the crew of Virgilians organized in the 1930s and lasted until 1964. The members were Italian New Orleanians who were not yet allowed in the Old Line cruise. The restriction have been eased on nationalities like Italian, Irish, and German, but Jewish people and African Americans are still not often considered for membership in the Old Line cruise. O'Neill explains in her book that these old societies care more about your ancestry than any personal accomplishments. She also explains that the Old Line cruise look down on the new super crews who seem to allow anyone who can pay to join. They consider it a society that you can buy your way into, while the Old Line crews are nearly impossible to join if you're not born into it. Another possible inadvertent nod to the hereditary royalty of Europe. I hope we've learned from the mistakes of the Habsburgs. In 1946, Mardi Gras faced a strike on the men who carry the flambeau. This was the first year returning after hiatus during World War II. The parades were delayed and many of the flambeaux did not march, but Mardi Gras rolled on. 1961 saw an attempt to boycott the Zulu parade by leaders in the black community, claiming that the tradition was degrading to the race. While the chosen king that year did step down, the parade rolled as scheduled. To this day, controversy remains around the masking traditions of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club. A quiet contingent periodically attempts to remind the masses that blackface is not acceptable anywhere else. The Historic Society, however, maintains that their tradition, using makeup instead of masks, stems from the origins of the parade, when masking was not allowed for people of color. In 1979, a police strike to join the Teamsters Union instead of the police union led to the cancellation of several parades. Striking policemen defied court orders and state troopers came to substitute. The police initially declared a victory in the strike using Mardi Gras as a strategic strike time, but in the end, the mayor successfully prevented them from joining the Teamsters Union. In 1988, the so-called Coconut Bill exempted carnival societies from, quote, liability claims resulting from inadvertent coconut-caused injuries, unquote. allowing the crews to shower the crowds with their precious throws without worry. In 1991, City Council person Dororthy Mae Taylor launched a campaign to rid Mardi Gras societies of their racist roots and change the face of Mardi Gras as we know it. This campaign is the reason that Rex is the only 19th century carnival society that still parades. Rather than integrate an open membership to other groups of people, many of the crews decided to close ranks and stop parading entirely. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests kicked off yet another controversy regarding race and Mardi Gras. The captain of the Mystic Crew of Nyxed, a former law enforcement professional, posted an All Lives Matter meme in response to the Black Lives Matter protests. At the time, Nyxed was one of the largest super crews that existed, and it was comprised of an extremely diverse membership, many of whom objected to their organization projecting that message. The controversy erupted into claims of irresponsible management of the club's money, including stealing tips designated for the float drivers. In the end, the membership of Nyxed splintered. The new crews they created in the wake were intentional in their goal of diversity among their membership. Rumors that Nyxed has paraded with their husbands in wigs to ensure they meet the minimum rider count for parade permits persist, as the membership and attendees at the parade both dwindle. According to Hardy, Rex helped turn Mardi Gras into a tourist attraction, and the city pays more attention to what is good for tourists than the actual citizens of the city as a result. O'Neill agrees with this sentiment, writing, quote, "The economists warn that dependence on tourist purse strings diverts public administrators and politicians' attention away from developing strategies and solutions to growing the economy in ways that resolve the city's many social problems," unquote. As a current citizen, even my fellow citizens seem to kowtow to the needs of tourists over our own needs, with short-sighted visions of temporarily overflowing pockets after a festival. The thing that New Orleans may be most well known for, Mardi Gras, the thing that makes us exceptional to the world, is also the thing that makes us most American. In the coming videos, I'll talk about why it matters that New Orleans is truly American and not some magical foreign place where the rest of the country leaves their worries.